You don't want to shelter your kids, but you also want to be able to protect them. Let me talk about that distinction. You see, you don't want your son to be a bubble boy or your daughter to be a girl. You can't lock them in some kind of a room or a corridor and shield them from all the debaucheries that go on throughout society. And even if you tried, it's not going to happen. They're going to hear some things at school, at the playground, around the neighborhood. That's just how life works. So if you try to do that, it's going to be a waste of your time. And honestly, if you try too hard to shelter your kids, we've seen examples through society. They usually go the polar opposite, and they counteract whatever you did. I mean, you've probably seen or heard of stories before. Maybe even grew up with somebody who they grew up in, a very strict household. They try to shield everything, and then they grow up and become a stripper or something like that. But in all seriousness, you want to avoid being like a helicopter parent, overprotective. That's what I talk about when I say sheltering your children. Now, on the flip side, you do want to protect your children. And by that, I mean you want to give them a moral foundation of what's right, what's wrong, what is decent under the eyes of God. And not saying that you'll be perfect yourself. I'm definitely far from perfect. I'll be the first to admit that. But at least give them the idea of what's right and what's wrong. I suggest that you do run some level of filter of everything that comes across your children's eyes and ears, especially in the moments where you can't specifically be there. Yeah, you don't have to hover over your kids 24/7, and that's impossible. They got to go to school. They got activities. They're going to be out playing with their friends and stuff. So you're not going to be hovering over them 24/7. But when they are in those situations and mom or dad aren't around, they have to know a distinction between what's right and what's wrong. So they don't get into the wrong car, hang out with the wrong car or the wrong crowd, put the wrong thing into their body, do the wrong thing to their body. Let me get a little more specific. Here's what I mean. When we watch a movie together, me and my family do something called family movie night. And we pick out movies that are decent, appropriate, that don't have any uh, weird connotations, like weird sexual innuendos or weird grooming behaviors and things like that in the movies. And we each take turns picking a movie, and then we'll go through it and be like, okay, first of all, is this movie under PG-13 because I have younger kids, and I'll look it up. I'll do research if I haven't seen the movie myself. I'll be like, okay, does this movie have any, sort of weird, I don't know, sexual activity? Does it have, blood or excessive violence? Things like that. And yeah, like some movies have goofy cartoon violence. If you're watching a movie with Bugs Bunny or something like that, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that is just way over the top. And even so, sometimes you watch a movie or a TV show and then something out of nowhere comes in that you didn't expect. Now, here's where the protection part comes in. You have to explain to your children what's going on. If it's something that's wrong or immoral, you just have to explain it that way. You have to be upfront about it. Say you're watching a movie, I don't know, it's supposed to be kid friendly or whatever, and then you see, a man cross dressing, wearing a dress or something. No big deal. You explain to your kids, hey, I know this is like a funny cartoon, but that's something that we don't do. We don't, you know, you're talking to your son, you don't walk around in feminine clothing. That's, in other words, you explain to him like what's going on. That's not normal. Here's the reality of it. You watch a movie, you watch a cartoon, and somebody gets blown up and there's body parts everywhere, and you explain to your kids, okay, that's not normal. People don't just like blow up and they're still alive or they don't get hurt that much. That's real. I think we overestimate our kid, and our kids, they're wonderful, intelligent, well read, well versed. But sometimes you just have to have a little explanation as to what's going on and not just assume they know everything or they're able to compartmentalize from right and wrong. That's why we hear about stories of kids. I remember used to hear stories like that a lot, even when I was younger, of kids that would like get hurt, get paralyzed, get injured because they were performing wrestling moves that they saw on WWF or WCW because they didn't realize that, it was scripted, it was fake. So they try to do like, Macho Man Randy Savage or something like that. I'm not making light of it, but I'm just saying we think it's obvious that, oh, that's all studio stuff, it's fake, it's not real. But some kids, 5, 6, 7-year old children, oftentimes they can't really distinguish the difference between that. They think that they won't get hurt, that they won't get injured, or something dangerous won't happen. So sometimes you have to have those talks, if for any reason, just to be like, hey, are we good? Are we okay? Do we realize that there's a separation between fact and fiction here? And when you have those talks, sometimes your kids, be wise and intelligent enough, they'll almost roll your eyes at you like, okay, like obviously, Dad, I know that, getting blown up or getting hurt or something like that, that's not real. Okay, cool. I'm glad that you know that. If you ever have any questions, you're ever curious about something, or I see something that seems suspicious, we can have this talk. Okay, cool. So you've opened up the communication and you let your kids know that, whatever weird, obscure, outlandish, violent, overly aggressive stuff, there's an explanation for anything. Yeah, so really what I'm saying is open up communication and talk with your kids and really talk with the family as a whole. And again, while you can protect your kids, or excuse me, while you don't want to shelter your kids and you do want to protect them, keep in mind too that there are going to be times where they're not directly under your eyesight and some other kid who maybe doesn't have parents that pay attention or that filter them or have good Christian values, they're going to be around people like that. Like even now as an adult, of course, I'm a devoted Christian. I do things to the best of my ability morally. Jesus is my Lord. But I know that I'm going to go out in the world and there's going to be people not like that. Now, I'm of an age, I'm 40 years old as of this video. I'm of a certain age and cognitive ability that I'm able to distinguish and separate. In other words, some random person who, hates Jesus and all this stuff and goes ranting and raving, it's not going to change my demeanor and disposition. I know who I am. My brain's not going to be so malleable and plastic that it's going to fall for that. But a small 6-year-old, 7-year-old children, or excuse me, 6-year-old, 7-year-old child might hear something like that and just follow along with it because kids tend to have more brain plasticity. They're still developing. They're still very much dependent on, especially if there's an older adult or some influence, they can gravitate to that. And what you need to do as a parent is you need to be the main baseline authority, moving righteously under God, of course, of what your kids view as right or wrong. So that when they get in a situation where they're not under your direct supervision, they're able to make good decisions. They're able to do something that doesn't embarrass their parents, doesn't embarrass their family. For example, they're older, they're a teenager or something like that, and there's some other, friends, classmates that are, drinking a bunch of alcohol or something like that. And because of the values that hopefully you've instilled in them, they think twice before doing something like that, before they drink a bunch of beer or whatever and end up embarrassing you, getting in some kind of legal trouble. Hopefully they have that discernment. But if you're not having these talks, if you're not having any sort of distinction of what's right and wrong with your children, or you're just fluid about what your ideas of right and wrong are because you don't have a moral base, then you're really destined for trouble within your family. So you have to pay attention to these things. Let me go back a little bit here because I'm talking so much about protecting your children. You have to have a good foundation yourself. If you're not in a position to be telling anybody anything because you've been living an immoral, indecent life, then it's not going to resonate with your kids. When my kids see me and I tell them, hey, don't curse, don't, use profanities, don't use the N-word, I don't have to say it over and over again and beg them to do it. Why? Because I don't talk like that. I don't interact with people like that. I tell my kids, don't do drugs, don't drink, don't get drunk, don't do all kinds of, behaviors like that. It's easy for me to say that. Why? Because I don't engage in it. I don't do it. Now, if I had been, I don't want to be one of those people that says, do as I say, not as I do, because it just doesn't hit the same. So you have to have your moral base. You have to have your moral standards. And I'll say this time and time again, the best place to get a moral viewpoint and a moral foundation is from God. The Word of God is the foundation. The Word of God, in a broad context, has every single thing that you need to be a righteous and decent person. It should be the foundation and template of everything that you teach your kids, everything that you even interact with. Not to say that you won't stumble, not to say that you won't make mistakes, but it's always something to run back to and turn back to in case you stumble and fall. What a lot of people do is they stumble, they fall in the darkness, and then they just hang out there. And they try to retool it and manipulate it and say that, well, I'm not that bad. I'm not as bad as that person, or I can handle whatever's going on, with no moral guidance foundation. And then people just come up with all these hippie ideas of, these arbitrary ideas of what's right and what's wrong. Hey, just be kind to everybody. Hey, kids. And they tell their kids, hey, just be kind to everybody. They have no foundation of what kindness is, what moral is, because they hold no accountability of themselves towards God. So who's to say what being kind is? You could slap somebody across the face and think they were being kind because I could have slapped you twice, but only slapped you once. Obviously that's not being kind if you have any sort of moral foundation. But if you're not accountable to anybody, how are you going to tell somebody to be kind? Same thing with your kids. If you tell your kids to be kind and decent, but they don't know where that foundation is coming from because they see you acting like a fool or not holding them accountable when something weird comes across their face. So without going off on too much more of a tangent, again, watch what your kids do, what they say, what they pick up, what they learn from their friends, even what they learn from their teachers. You got to watch that too. I'm not talking down to teachers, but you got to watch what comes home from school, what they put in the curriculum, because, they'll have your kids thinking all kinds of stuff. They'll have your kids thinking that, they randomly just came from, an amoeba, or, they evolved from a monkey or something like that. Things that discredit a creator, the God that we have, and they'll try to downplay that. And then they'll start taking that as from theory, and they'll start thinking of it as fact. If you don't double check and, make sure that you have a talk about what's going on. But these are the kind of things that you really need to be doing. So protect your children, teach them right from wrong with that biblically sound, biblically moral base, or else you risk the chance of them being a victim to who knows. A lot of entities out there that really want to get into your kids' minds and infiltrate their hearts. There's groomers out there. There's sick and twisted people out there. They want your kids' money. They want your kids' health. Probably one of the best examples I can think of is, if any of you are old enough to remember Joe Camel cigarette cartoons, they be in magazines and comic books, and it was a cartoon camel smoking cigarettes. Who do you think the target audience was? Your children. And now they don't have anything like that nowadays, but for a good time, I remember in my childhood, that was a normal thing. You'd open up a magazine or something like that, and there'd be a cartoon camel. He'd be cool. He'd be like driving a sports car. He'd have a girl camel, wrapped around his arm, and he'd be smoking cigarettes. Who do you think they were aiming for? This is what I mean. There are people that are out there that want to infiltrate your kids' minds and their hearts. For what? Most likely for money, or for, Satan trying to infiltrate however he can, because whatever Satan can do to infiltrate from the foundation, that's why he's so hell-bent on destroying the family. He's hell-bent on coming after kids. I'm not going to go super deep into it. That's for another video. But he wants to destroy the image of God in any way that he can. And imaging, subtly or more direct, is one of the tools that he uses today. So again, like I said earlier, the technology and the means themselves aren't inherently evil, but the intentions of who use it or who puts it out there, they can be. So in conclusion, watch out for your kids. Don't have to put them in a bubble, but protect them. Run everything that they see, hear, watch, mess with. Run it by your parental filter. Run it by God. All right? Have a wonderful day. Peace.